Welcome everyone. Here is Agata Morka with Spark Europe today, broadcasting live from my living room in Berlin. And I am here today with Kaitlin Thaney, and Kaitlin is a passionate open access advocate with a very long history of helping organizations think about the questions of sustainability, participatory design, and program design. So you worked for such giants as Mozilla or the Wikimedia Foundation, for which you raised over $40 million. You are a board member of the Code for Science and Society, Lyrasis, and DuraSpace. And currently you are executive director of Invest in Open Infrastructure, which is a non-profit organization pretty much looking for ways of improving funding and resourcing for open infrastructure solutions that are used in the scholarly communications ecosystem. You describe yourself as a systems nerd and an early bird. Hence, we are having this meeting in what is Thursday morning on your side of the Atlantic and an early afternoon on mine. So welcome, Kaitlin. Here is hoping for some really nerdy early morning talk about open infrastructure here today. So hello again, and I think let's just dive straight in. I think that I would like to start with basics. So first of all, what does open infrastructure mean to you, and how would you define it?
It's a great question, and thank you, Agata. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. This feels late in my morning because we have a young toddler who pushes our limits on that side. So the question of how we define open infrastructure, in my sort of view for that, I think of open infrastructure as the sort of series or the systems of open services, protocols, standards, and software that research and scholarship rely on. So when you think of infrastructure, there's often, and you think of it in terms of, roads and bridges and physical infrastructure, I find it helpful to think of, the ways in which those systems operate in many cases underneath the surface, but you notice that reliance when they are gone. And so I think that, we continually, with our steering committee for Invest in Open Infrastructure and with the open infrastructure community, I think we're continually refining that definition as it sort of evolves in terms of what our dependencies for research and scholarship are. But on a broad sense, I think if I were to explain open infrastructure to someone who is not as closely involved as you or the community that might be watching this are, thinking of it as, the underlying open, technologies, systems, and standards that are needed in order to perform the functions of sharing knowledge and supporting the broader research lifecycle.
Thank you. And speaking of open infrastructure, so how important is an open infrastructure, not just infrastructure in general, but an open one?
It's also, a really interesting point. And I think we're at this inflection period and have been for a number of years where when we talk about the choices that we make when it comes to software and systems and even things that go layers beyond sort of the software and systems. So when you start thinking of the underlying metadata or identifiers or information that powers all of that, we've seen sort of an increase over the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years in terms of the privatization of that and also the ramifications of that information being commoditized or being utilized for interests that are not aligned with that of the broader research and scholarly community, but more for the needs of profits and commercialization. And so when we think about, open technology and open systems has been part of, my sort of career for about 15 years, starting from Creative Commons through, where we are today. I think what we've started to realize is that, there are not only different variants and different shades of open, there are also different levels to me when it comes to the participation and what that means for how responsive systems are and how accountable they might be to the people that they're supposed to serve. And so that level of importance, not only in terms of ensuring that the intentional decisions we're making around the systems that we are putting our information into, that we are relying for sharing our information, that might be collecting information about us, that those are really operating in a way that is there to advance the sharing of information, knowledge, and society.
Thank you. And last year, Invest in Open Infrastructure, together with Spark Europe, you actually conducted quite an interesting project. So you interviewed a range of open science services or infrastructures. So I wanted to go back to this project, and I wanted to ask you, what did you learn from it? And what did you find, I don't know, most striking from what you heard in these interviews, in these conversations?
That project, and you can find those both on the Spark Europe website as well as on the Invest in Open website. What I found really fascinating about those individual, they're kind of vignettes and interviews with, I believe, 10 key infrastructures, some of them for-profit infrastructures, some of those in for-profit solutions, as well as others that are on the open source side. And I think what was really fascinating for me was getting to hear from the individuals who are leading those projects about the decisions that they made along the way. Invest in Open Infrastructure. I mean, we have invest in the name. We are about the funding and resourcing and sustainability of this work. And so it is, very much in our day-to-day to be talking about business models or decisions that might lead towards, being able to support, scale, expand, or, further extend the reach so that, the accessibility of these tools is there. And so, we got to hear from these individuals about decisions where they viewed, open as not a viable solution based on competitiveness, or for the durability or resilience of the product that they were looking to put forward, why some of those decisions or what some of those decisions looked like from the inside. And I think, we also Invest in Open Infrastructure. I joined this project literally the day that New York City, where I live, went into lockdown. And so, I know there's a lot that has been brought into stark relief in terms of some of the more fragile points of how we support this ecosystem, how this ecosystem operates, that we had an ability to dig into in a really timely, urgent manner this past year. And part of the work that we did alongside that project was working with a number of individuals around the world that were invested in the future of scholarship, from library administrators, those who are involved in preprints, infrastructure providers, scholarly societies, and presses, to kind of look at various points there. And one thing that I think is a through line between the interviews we did in collaboration with Spark Europe, as well as what we heard from, over 100, I think it was over 112 different participants for this project, was that when it comes down to it, yes, there is a desire to choose open solutions and to have that be baked into the values and principles of the organization or institution. But also there is this kind of competing need when it comes to the need for reliable, durable, and in some cases competitive solutions. And so, to kind of weave that back to what we learned from those stories, as well as your initial question about why open is needed. There are some that view it as we need competitive solutions alongside these other for-profit or commercial solutions. I think also a bigger point is that there need to be options, that, there needs to be, an ability for there to be not just one group controlling a space that forces behavior and forces a certain way in which scholarship evolves. And that, to me, I think is probably one of the most important areas that those interviews start to highlight about, how that may have affected their decision-making, how that may have affected their customers, and how that may have affected how the space has evolved over the course of a number of years.
That's perfect, because that it's actually a really great segue to one of my next questions, because I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about a certain balance, or the lack of balance between commercial and non-commercial players that support open infrastructure. So what do you think? What can the academic community do to help create a more balance of power between these commercial and non-commercial players that support open infrastructure to ensure some kind of more equitable access to knowledge for all?
You know, it's something that we've been thinking really deeply about. So the work from that research effort, the Future Open Scholarship Project, which we'll be sharing out over the course of the next few months, part of that was not only talking about some near-term interventions and solutions to build more resilient systems with the existing systems and frameworks that are in play, on more of like a medium-term time scale, really thinking about collective action. And, you know, I know that you'd recently talked to Peter Suber. I mean, it brings me back to discussions from, you know, a number of years ago, I think at this point, maybe 12, 13 years ago, with the advent of open access policies that were being rolled out from institutions. You know, I still remember the days where, you know, scholarly addendum engine, or, you know, a way in which a scholar could print out something to attach with their submission to say, you know, by accepting the submission, I get to retain my rights to put it into a repository. And, you know, there were cases, and many at that point, of the, and sorry for the child that you hear in the background.
That's life. That's great.
That's life. But also where the shift from having that be a negotiation from an individual scholar against, say, a big publishing giant like Elsevier versus the faculty of arts and sciences community at an institution to that. I do think that there are opportunities that we need to start exploring where we can look at the collective power of institutional leaders who are in many cases the main consumers, but also customers for many of these solutions, or involved in, you know, these broader you know, vendor relationships, service provider relationships that help provide additional support and efficiency to, you know, offset some of the staffing resourcing challenges that are not going to be fixed overnight, but I do think we can take steps forward. And so what I find really interesting, looking at other areas in adjacent spaces. So for example, outside of some of the more scholarly publishing side of things, the Python community has had a long-standing history with working with those, not only on a vendor side of the house, but also in terms of for-profit industry relationships, donated staff, donated talent, but also more recently, which I found really interesting, talking about reciprocity for those who are benefiting or profiting off of open source technologies, like, you know, the Python sort of stack, and also things like the Jupyter notebooks and that sort of layer of offerings. That there is a call for those organizations to give back. And we saw an example with a group that's based down in Texas called Anaconda, who commercializes these tools. The founders of Anaconda are also the founders of a fiscal sponsor called NumFocus, which actually sponsors a number of nonprofit scientific software projects. So that's where IPython as a project was first housed, as well as the Julia project and a number of other scientific computing efforts. But to say, you know, a certain amount of our profits or of our dividends that we're, you know, the value that we're extracting from having this support for commercial solution based on something that's open source, we are going to commit to dedicating that back to the community through a nonprofit, through a community process to direct those funds back to support. And I think that we need to start to explore and to look at where there might be other areas we can borrow from to talk about how to bring them into better balance. Where does it make sense to work alongside one another? Where does it make sense to, you know, have certain forms of alignment or certain means of ensuring that we're working towards the same goals, and that those are directed in a way that feels safe and that feels productive? But also, you know, for organizations that are, you know, there to profit off of some of the inefficiencies, that they are provided an opportunity and also called for giving back in a way that allows them to be, you know, good citizens, and to ensure that the space is not just relying on institutions and philanthropies and maybe some government funding here or there to support a, you know, really core stack that is relied upon by the scholarly community writ large.
That's a wonderful thought for the future. And I wanted to, to ask a little bit more about your vision for the future also. So you touched upon it a little bit already. So of course, there are lots of ways in which you can sustain operations of open infrastructures. But is there a particular pathway that you would recommend the scholarly community to consider promoting in the future?
Oh, that's a big question. I feel like there's so much that depends on the environment in which those decisions are being made. So, for example, if you look at the history of national funding networks in Europe versus the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
there are different, or even in Latin and South America, right? With some of the work around diamond open access, and I know there's a great study that Spark Europe and other colleagues have recently put out about that. There's very different. I mean, to be really tactical, there's very different connotations and histories when it comes to thinking about not only funding but also relationships to money. That I think is important to make sure that we're not forgetting in those contexts. I think on our end, I'm dedicating our work to not only examining what those additional potential pools of capital, to be franker, pools of funding might look like, pools of support. And when I say funding and support, also thinking about not just the actual funding or money that might be able to go towards a project, but other sorts of levels of support in terms of staffing, in terms of hosting, in terms of service provider relationships, in terms of trusted service provider relationships, things that also are involved in that systems thinking sort of way. But really digging into mapping out who are the current players, where are there opportunities to further expand and diversify that pool of support. Because I do think that when we think about resilience and the durability of this work, understanding that there are in many cases caps to relationships that are for say a particular funding institution, and understanding how we can ensure that that is supported by either a different set of players to allow for there to be some sort of safety mechanism, that if, and we saw this past year, with some of the membership-based models, if one or two major institutions pull their support, does that dramatically affect, does that potentially put a project into, needing to provide a migration pathway to another solution? Or are there other places where, different groups can absorb some of the space there or provide, a different sustainable way? And so I think on a very broad sense, really talking about, what are the mechanisms in which this infrastructure, can be supported by a diverse set of players. What does a relationship for those players look like? Does it make sense? Are there incentives? For example, I sort of think about it as almost like, you've got your starter capital, you've got funding for scaling and growing, you've got operational versus development support that are often talked about when you think about the different levels of support. I think there also needs to be potentially something to look at, what is the sort of incentive funding to also build the connectors, to talk about the maintenance of this work, to ensure that, different systems can talk to one another, and that we're thinking of contingencies so that, should something like this past year happen again, should there be some other different shift in the network, that, the infrastructures that we so rely on aren't left to be more exposed than they could be with a different sort of model there. But it is something that we're going to be dedicating more of our time to, and building some research capacity so we can share out some resources for some models that we've seen employed, because I do think that there might not be one size fit all type model, but I think that there are lessons that we can learn to employ across the way.
Wonderful. You said that you're looking more into these solutions. So I am very much looking forward to hear more about that. I guess that it's coming. And I think with this rather optimistic thought in mind, I think that we'll close here then.
That sounds great.
Thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank you
Kaitlin.
so much.